In the long shadow of European history, few rulers cast as dark and unforgettable a figure as Henry VIII of England. He was not a conqueror who clawed his way to the throne, nor a revolutionary who overthrew kings. He inherited power, yet in his hands, that inheritance became a weapon, one that turned a bright Renaissance prince into a tyrant whose name remained synonymous with blood, betrayal, and unchecked ambition. When Henry Tudor was crowned in 1509, England was a nation still healing. The Wars of the Roses had torn its nobility apart. And though his father, Henry VII, had secured the crown through battle and cunning diplomacy, the Tudor dynasty was fragile, still proving its right to rule. The young Henry seemed the perfect answer to England's uncertainty. He was tall, handsome, athletic, and well-educated, the very image of Renaissance promise. At first glance, his reign promised glory. His court glittered with scholars, poets, and diplomats. His charm dazzled allies and adversaries alike. But behind the pageantry lay a darker truth. Henry's hunger for power and legacy was insatiable. He wanted not just to rule, but to dominate, to be remembered as the greatest monarch England had ever seen, no matter the cost. What began as the reign of a golden prince quickly curdled into something far more sinister. Henry came to see people not as companions, but as pawns. Friends, ministers, even wives, all could be cast aside, imprisoned, or executed if they failed to serve his desires. His paranoia grew, his cruelty sharpened, and his court became a place where loyalty was rewarded with suspicion, and where favor could turn to death overnight. The central obsession that consumed him was the question of succession. In a world where dynasties lived or died with the strength of their bloodline, Henry was determined to secure a son. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, gave him years of loyalty, intelligence, and dignity. But her inability to produce a surviving male heir became, in Henry's mind, a divine curse. He convinced himself that God punished him for marrying his brother's widow. Despite the Pope's blessing that had legitimized the union, when the Vatican refused his plea for annulment, Henry made a choice that would fracture Christendom and define his legacy. He severed ties with Rome, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. What began as a quest for an heir became a revolution in faith, power, and politics. From that moment forward, no one, not queen, minister, or subject was safe. Henry's reign would stretch nearly 4 decades, marked by broken alliances, shattered families, and rivers of blood. By the end, the once vibrant king was a bloated, diseased tyrant, feared by his people and haunted by the ghosts of those he had destroyed. The tragedy of Henry VIII is not only in the lives he ended, but in the promise he betrayed. He could have been remembered as England's Renaissance hero. Instead, history remembers him as the king who placed his throne upon a mountain of corpses and called it greatness. Choice at all. The English Reformation wasn't born from theological conviction. It was born from Henry's unwillingness to accept any authority higher than his own. The break with Rome in 1534 marked the beginning of Henry's transformation from king to tyrant. By declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, he had effectively made himself God's representative on earth within his realm. This wasn't just a political move. It was the ultimate expression of his megalomania. Now, not only could he make laws and wage wars, but he could also determine the spiritual fate of his subjects. Thomas More, the brilliant humanist who had served as Henry's Lord Chancellor, understood exactly what the king was becoming. More's refusal to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the church wasn't just about religious principle. It was about recognizing that no mortal man should wield such absolute power. His execution in 1535 marked the first time Henry killed someone whose only crime was refusing to validate his ego. The execution of Thomas More sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Here was a man universally respected for his learning and integrity, killed simply because he wouldn't bend the knee to Henry's spiritual authority. More's death wasn't just murder. It was a declaration that Henry's will was now the highest law in England, superseding even conscience and faith. With Catherine of Aragon cast aside, and the Church of England firmly under his control, Henry was free to pursue his obsession with Anne Boleyn. The woman who had captivated the king was everything Catherine was not: young, vivacious, and seemingly fertile. Henry's courtship of Anne had already lasted several years, and his desperation to possess her had driven him to tear apart the religious fabric of his kingdom. Anne Boleyn understood the dangerous game she was playing. She had watched Henry's ruthless treatment of Catherine and knew that royal favor could turn to royal fury in an instant. Yet, she also recognized that her influence over the king gave her unprecedented power. For a time, she wielded that power skillfully, placing her supporters in key positions and advancing the Protestant cause in England. The wedding of Henry and Anne in 1533 was conducted in secret, as the king's marriage to Catherine had not yet been officially annulled. This clandestine ceremony revealed much about Henry's character. He was willing to commit bigamy to get what he wanted, then use his royal authority to retroactively legitimize his actions. The law wasn't something that bound him, it was something he shaped to his will. When Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, Henry's disappointment was palpable. Another daughter meant another failure in his quest for a male heir. The king who had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn now began to see her as just another obstacle to his dynastic ambitions. The woman who had once been his greatest obsession was becoming his greatest disappointment. Anne's subsequent miscarriages only deepened Henry's resentment. By 1536, he had convinced himself that his second marriage was as cursed as his first. The same paranoid thinking that had led him to break with Rome now turned against the woman who had once been the center of his world. Anne Boleyn, who had risen so high, was about to fall further than anyone could have imagined. The charges brought against Anne Boleyn in 1536 were so outrageous that they revealed the depths of Henry's paranoia and cruelty. Accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, Anne faced allegations that were almost certainly fabricated. The king, who had once written love letters to her, now orchestrated her destruction with the same methodical ruthlessness he had shown toward Thomas More. The trial of Anne Boleyn was a mockery of justice, with the outcome predetermined by Henry's will. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses were compromised, and the proceedings were conducted with unseemly haste. Yet, the very fact that a Queen of England could be tried for treason and adultery sent a clear message. No one, regardless of rank or previous favor, was safe from the king's wrath. Anne's execution on May 19, 1536, marked a new level of brutality in Henry's reign. The woman who had been his queen for barely 3 years was beheaded by a French swordsman, a supposed mercy, as it was quicker than the traditional axe. As he knelt in the Tower of London, preparing for death, Henry was already planning his next marriage scheduled for the very next day. The speed with which Henry moved from Anne's execution to his marriage to Jane Seymour revealed the calculating coldness at the heart of his character. There was no period of mourning, no reflection on the tragedy that had just unfolded. For Henry, Anne's death was simply a necessary step in his continuing quest for a male heir. Her life had been reduced to nothing more than a failed experiment. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, represented everything the king thought he wanted in a queen. Unlike the strong-willed Catherine and Anne, Jane was submissive, quiet, and seemingly malleable. She had watched the fates of her predecessors and understood that survival in Henry's court required absolute compliance with his will. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," perfectly encapsulated her approach to marriage with the increasingly tyrannical king. The birth of Edward V, in October 1537, finally gave Henry the male heir he had desperately sought. The joy that swept through the court was palpable. After nearly 3 decades of marriage and multiple wives, The Tudor dynasty seemed secure. Yet even this triumph was tainted by tragedy, as Jane Seymour died just 12 days after giving birth, likely from complications related to the delivery. Jane's death affected Henry more deeply than the executions of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, perhaps because she had given him what he wanted most. For once, the king seemed to experience genuine grief rather than merely frustrated anger. Yet even this sorrow was filtered through his obsession with legacy. Jane had died a hero in his eyes because she had fulfilled her primary purpose as a royal wife. The years following Jane's death saw Henry's paranoia reach new heights. The king, who had once been confident in his power, now saw threats everywhere. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising in northern England, had shaken his confidence in his subjects' loyalty. His response was characteristically brutal. Hundreds of rebels were executed, and Henry made it clear that any challenge to his authority would be met with overwhelming force. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant administrator who had helped orchestrate Henry's break with Rome, became the next victim of the king's increasing instability. Cromwell had arranged Henry's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, and the king's embarrassment over this political miscalculation needed a scapegoat. The man who had served Henry faithfully for over a decade was executed in 1540, his head displayed on London Bridge as a warning to others. The execution of Thomas Cromwell marked a turning point in Henry's reign. No longer was he content to eliminate only those who openly opposed him. Now he was willing to destroy even his most capable servants when they failed to meet his impossible standards. The message was clear. Proximity to power was not protection from the king's wrath. It was an invitation to destruction. By the 1540s, Henry had become the monster that his earlier actions had foreshadowed. The handsome athletic prince who had taken the throne in 1509 was now a bloated, diseased tyrant who ruled through fear and intimidation. His court had become a place where even the slightest misstep could result in death, and his subjects lived in constant terror of attracting his attention. The pattern of Henry's marriages had become grimly predictable: infatuation, marriage, disappointment, and destruction. Anne of Cleves was fortunate to escape with her life, accepting an annulment and a generous settlement rather than facing the king's wrath. But Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, would not be so lucky. Her youth and beauty had attracted Henry's attention, but her alleged infidelities, real or imagined, would seal her fate. Catherine Howard's execution in 1542 demonstrated that Henry had learned nothing from his previous murders. Once again, a young woman paid with her life for the king's obsessions and paranoia. The charges against Catherine were based largely on her sexual history before marriage and alleged relationships during her brief time as queen. The evidence was questionable. The trial was rushed and the outcome was inevitable. The speed and brutality of Catherine Howard's destruction shocked even Henry's hardened courtiers. She was barely 20 years old when she was beheaded, and her crime was largely one of youth and inexperience rather than malicious intent. Yet Henry showed no mercy, no recognition of his own role in placing a teenager in an impossible position. Her death was simply another casualty in his war against anyone who failed to meet his expectations. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, understood the deadly game she was entering when she married the king in 1543. She had watched 5 previous queens navigate the treacherous waters of marriage to Henry VIII, and she was determined to survive where others had failed. Her strategy was simple: complete submission and careful avoidance of any topic that might trigger the king's paranoia. The later years of Henry's reign were marked by increasing physical and mental deterioration. The athletic young king had become a grotesque figure, suffering from what historians believe was a combination of diabetes, kidney disease, and possibly syphilis. His leg ulcers had become so infected that the smell could be detected from rooms away, and his mood swings had become even more unpredictable and violent. As Henry's body failed him, his paranoia reached its peak. The king, who had once been surrounded by friends and admirers, now trusted no one completely. Even Catherine Parr, his most diplomatic wife, found herself under investigation for heresy in 1546. Only her quick thinking and complete submission saved her from becoming the third of Henry's wives to face execution. The final years of Henry's life revealed the full horror of what he had become. The court that had once been the envy of Europe was now a place of whispered conversations and constant fear. Nobles, who had once competed for the king's attention, now prayed to avoid it, knowing that royal favor could turn to royal fury without warning. The very foundations of English society had been warped by one man's unchecked power and limitless ego. By 1546, Henry's physical condition had become truly grotesque. Contemporary accounts describe a man so swollen with disease that he had to be lifted by mechanical devices. His once handsome face had become bloated and pockmarked. His body emitted a constant stench from his infected wounds, and his temper had become so unpredictable that servants approached him with visible terror. The king's eating habits had become as monstrous as his personality. Unable to exercise due to his physical condition, Henry consumed massive quantities of food and drink, further exacerbating his health problems. His dining table became a scene of royal gluttony, with the king gorging himself, while his subjects struggled with poverty and the aftermath of his religious reforms. Henry's relationship with his children during his final years reflected his twisted priorities. He had spent decades obsessing over male succession, yet he barely knew his son Edward, who was being raised by tutors and servants. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were alternately legitimized and bastardized based on their father's changing whims and political needs. The psychological toll of Henry's reign extended far beyond his immediate victims. An entire generation of English nobility had grown up in fear of their king, never knowing when a careless word or perceived slight might result in death. The very fabric of English society had been rewoven around the thread of royal terror, creating a culture of suspicion and paranoia that would outlast Henry himself. Foreign ambassadors who visited Henry's court in his final years left behind accounts that read like descriptions of a madman's kingdom. The king, who had once been a major player in European politics, had become an object of fear and revulsion. His former allies now treated England as a rogue state, led by a tyrant whose unpredictability made him dangerous to friend and foe alike. The legacy of Henry's marriages had created a succession crisis that would plague England for decades. His desperate quest for male heirs had resulted in a complex web of legitimacy questions, religious divisions, and competing claims to the throne. The very dynasty he had fought so hard to secure had been weakened by his own actions. As 1547 dawned, it became clear that Henry VIII was dying. The man who had terrorized England for nearly 4 decades was finally succumbing to the diseases that had been consuming his body for years. Yet even in his final illness, he remained dangerous, issuing death warrants and ordering executions from his sickbed. The monster he had become would not be tamed even by approaching death. Henry's final days were spent in Windsor Castle, surrounded by the trappings of power that had meant everything to him. Yet those who attended him during his last weeks described a pathetic figure, a man whose body had betrayed him as completely as he had betrayed so many others. The stench from his infected leg ulcers was so overwhelming that few could bear to be in the same room. The king's mental state during his final illness revealed the full extent of his paranoia and self-deception. He continued to believe that he had been a good king, that his actions had been justified by necessity, and that history would remember him as great rather than monstrous. The man who had caused so much suffering seemed incapable of recognizing the horror he had inflicted upon his kingdom. Even his deathbed was marked by characteristic cruelty. Henry's final act as king was to sign the death warrant for Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, who was executed just days before the king's own death. This senseless murder, committed by a dying man against someone who posed no real threat perfectly, encapsulated the pointless brutality that had defined Henry's reign. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally died, his body consumed by the diseases that had been eating away at him for years. The man who had ruled through fear and intimidation spent his final moments in agony, his flesh rotting even as he clung to life. It was in many ways a fitting end for someone who had caused so much suffering. Death that was as unpleasant and degrading as the deaths he had inflicted upon others. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed the true state of the kingdom he was leaving behind. England was financially ruined, religiously divided, and politically unstable. The strong monarchy that Henry had believed he was building had actually been weakened by his excesses and cruelties. His son Edward was only 9 years old, hardly old enough to provide the strong leadership that the kingdom desperately needed. The reaction to Henry's death throughout Europe was telling. While diplomatic protocol required expressions of condolence, many foreign rulers privately celebrated the passing of a man they had come to see as a dangerous madman. The king, who had once been courted by emperors and popes, had died, isolated and reviled, his reputation in ruins. The disposal of Henry's body presented its own challenges. The king had become so bloated and diseased that special arrangements had to be made for his funeral. Legend claims that his corpse was so swollen with putrefaction that it burst open during the journey to Windsor, where he was to be buried. A grotesque end to a grotesque life. The legacy of Henry VIII extends far beyond the immediate damage he caused during his lifetime. His actions fundamentally altered the course of English history, creating religious and political divisions that would persist for centuries. The English Reformation, born from his ego rather than genuine religious conviction, would lead to decades of religious conflict and persecution. The psychological impact of Henry's reign on English culture cannot be overstated. An entire generation had grown up believing that absolute power was normal, that the king's will was law, and that resistance to royal authority was futile. This acceptance of tyranny would make it easier for future monarchs to abuse their power, knowing that their subjects had been conditioned to accept even the most outrageous royal behavior. Perhaps most tragically, Henry's obsession with male succession ultimately proved pointless. His son Edward VI died young and childless, leaving the throne to his daughters. The very people Henry had spent so much effort trying to bypass. The male heir he had murdered and tortured to obtain ruled for only 6 years, while his daughter Elizabeth would become one of England's greatest monarchs. The story of Henry VIII serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when power is exercised without restraint or accountability. The young prince, who had seemed destined for greatness, became a monster, whose very name still evokes horror more than 4 centuries after his death. His reign demonstrates that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it destroys, leaving devastation in its wake that can last for generations. In the end, Henry VIII got everything he thought he wanted: absolute power, religious authority, and historical significance. Yet the legacy he created was one of terror rather than greatness, of destruction rather than construction. The king, who had been so obsessed with being remembered as great, would indeed be remembered, but as one of history's most cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power and unlimited ego. Go.